Greetings everyone, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today I'm going to be doing an addendum to my video I did a while back called Was the Rambam a Racist? Just to kind of quickly run over the reason for that video in this one. A number of years ago, the Nation of Islam put out a book called The Secret History Between Jews and Blacks. And in the book, they used a number of incorrect sources, as well as bad translations, and one of which they were claiming that the Rambam was a racist. So in this video, I'm going to be re-debunking that, or even though I've debunked it before, but based on a new comment I got on that video, I'm going to be dealing with it in more detail. Okay, so here's the starting point. Essentially, a few days ago, I received a message on the previous video, and this is the message that was left. My suggestion is that you should pause it now if you want to read it as it is here, because this is exactly as it was written from the exact user. And the user claimed their name was Elohim Chaim, and essentially they have no real YouTube page. Just when I clicked on their own link, there was nothing there. They have no videos, nothing there. So it's kind of just like, I guess, a person using some blind name or title name in order to make comments. But essentially, I'm going to be debunking this group of comments that this person posted. And as I said before, you can kind of go through as I go through the video, and I'll be explaining in detail exactly what is the issue with this comment. Okay, now before we get into some of the details, I think it's first important to note that when people claim that Rambam is a racist, it's mostly based upon an issue, a small section, a very, very small section, that's mentioned in a book he wrote called the Moreh Nevuchim. Now, one of the problems with when people make these kind of claims about the Rambam is, first of all, you'd have to understand what his books or his writings are even about. You can't take an author's book and say, okay, well, they wrote one line here about something, they're this, without actually having understood what it is that they were writing to begin with. So the Moreh Nevuchim is essentially a book where the Rambam was getting into some philosophical areas. I've listed here in this particular description a couple of key points which are listed in green and yellow. The first being that the Moreh Nevuchim was originally written by the Rambam in what's called Judeo-Arabic, meaning that the language itself is a mixture of Hebrew and Arabic, mostly Arabic, but a particular type of Arabic used by Jews, and it's written in Hebrew script or Ashuri script. So essentially, that's the first green part, where that's kind of the detail, an important detail to know. The next detail that's good to know is that the guide, which is in English, it's called the Guide to the Perplexed, but it's called Moreh Nevuchim in Hebrew. So essentially, that it consists of 3 books. There's 3 sections to the book. The first section deals with the nature of the creator of all things, that is called Hashem. And it concludes with the fact that Hashem can't be described in positive terms, meaning that the essence or the being that created everything is not human, and it can't be described as human because that's just way more intense and more bigger than we are, and human understanding can't really describe something that is beyond humanity, if you will. The next part of the book, the second part, he examines the natural philosophy of one of the greatest scientists of his time, which was Aristotle. He used a lot of Aristotelian type of physics and things like that in a lot of his works because that was the science of his day. So he kind of matches that with theories of creation and duration of the universe, and the theories about how the universe works, or how the creator created the universe to work, which includes what people call in English angels and also prophecy. And in the last book, he expounds upon like some of the issues concerning the book of Ezekiel or Yehezkel in Hebrew, because there's a lot of kind of hidden material that's in that book, that it's not like a straightforward book that you can just read even in Hebrew and say, okay, oh, this is what it means, but it has a lot of information in there that only people who were advanced Torah scholars who knew Hebrew, knew Aramaic, knew the Torah, and knew Jewish history and halakha, Jewish law, and knew just philosophy could really understand it. And the Rambam, interestingly enough, wrote the Moreh Nevuchim to a student of his who was about to start learning Yehezkel. And initially, at the end of the book, he actually explains that this book was not meant for anyone else but his student, and it shouldn't be published. That essentially there was things in it that, were secret, that his student was supposed to be learning, but it was never to be like published as a book, even though eventually it was published as a book, but that was not his initial intent or his wishes. And one of the things he mentions and stresses to the book is that a student of any type who, finds himself in these kind of situations of dealing with science, reality, and things like that should always consider all theories, meaning they should never be locked down in one idea, but they should consider all the theories that exist and understand the reality based on those. So now that you've got a really quick overview of the Rambam's book, the Moreh Nevuchim, now we can deal with this particular YouTube user's comments. And I've broken up their 3 points into different colors. The first point being in yellow, the second point being in a light blue, and the third point being in a kind of gray. Now, I'll kind of run through. I mean, you can look at his particular writing. You can pause the video and actually read exactly what they wrote. But the first point that they actually make is that they claim that, that they watched my video like only now, as if something was blocking them from doing it for some reason. And according to what they claim here, is they say that one of the greatest researchers in authenticity of the Zohar and the Moreh Nevuchim was a rabbi named Yaakov or Jacob ben Tzvi Ashkenazi Emden. And they claim that he claimed that the Moreh Nevuchim was not written by the Rambam. The next point that they claim is that that I don't know any type of Arabic, including Judeo-Arabic, and essentially that the information that I had in my video is incorrect because of plurals concerning terms that are used in the text, as well as the actual locations, meaning the information that deals with supposedly the racial issues. I don't know what I'm talking about there. That's what this person is saying. And they're claiming that the information in the book is logically being very specific about groups of people, specifically in racial terminology. Now, it's important that you note that this person is claiming that the book is being racial. Okay. Now, the third point that they make is that the author of the Guide to the Perplexed is definitely a racist, as they claim, and is definitely using things that are like anti anyone who's not Semitic, meaning yellow and black races. Again, this person's bringing up race. Now, this is going to be important when I go through this later on, that you notice that this person is making a lot of westernized racial comments, and it's going to come into play later on when we discuss this issue to see whether they're telling the truth or not, or whether they even know what they're talking about. So those are the main 3 points. I'm going to get into a lot more detail about each point individually as it comes up, but I'm going to break them out now into each individual point and debunk each one. So let's debunk the first point. Okay, so the first point that they claim is according to what they wrote, and I'll read it as he's written it. According to many rabbanim, meaning many rabbis, he says, i.e. the greatest researcher on authenticity of the Zohar, Moreh Nevuchim, etc., named the Yaavitz, meaning Rabbi Jacob ben Tzvi Ashkenazi Emden, Moreh Nevuchim was not written by the Rambam. Okay, that's an interesting claim here. According to many rabbanim. Now, that's an interesting thing to put there, because when you say according to many, you have to be able to show that you're talking about a number of people. But he's only listed one person here. So let's go through and debunk this one by one. Debunk number 1. Rabbi Jacob ben Tzvi Ashkenazi Emden was never considered to be the greatest researcher of authenticity of the Moreh Nevuchim or even the Zohar. Debunk number 1. And I will be explaining this in a little bit. Debunk number 2. The author of the Guide to Perplex also claims to be the author of the Mishnah Torah and other works that the Rambam wrote, and that everybody agrees that the Rambam wrote, and even those texts have his signature on them. We'll get into that in a little bit also. Debunk number 3. The Rambam's own son attests that the Rambam wrote the Guide to the Perplexed. Oh, okay, that's a tough one there. We'll get into that in just a little bit also. So let's deal with the first point. Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Okay, so dealing with Rabbi Emden, the initial claim here is that that the person made is that Rabbi Emden, like for example, claimed that the Rambam didn't write the Moreh Nevuchim. Well, here is an English translation of what one of the things that Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote concerning the Moreh Nevuchim. Now, one of the issues he mentions is that he actually was quite favorable of the Rambam's writings when it came to like Jewish law, called halakha. So when it came to halakhic matters, he considered Rambam to basically be a big pillar amongst Jewish scholars in that area, and he, basically spoke very highly of him. But it is widely known that Rabbi Emden did not really have a big philosophical interest. He was not really into like philosophical stuff when it came to the Torah, and this is where he had a big issue with the Moreh Nevuchim, or the Guide to the Perplexed. He basically claimed that it was hard for him to believe that the same person who wrote the Mishnah Torah would be writing things that are found in the Moreh Nevuchim. Now, he doesn't say he knew this for a fact, that this author, but he's just saying, oh, I can't believe that this person wrote this because I read this other book they wrote, and I like that book, but this book that I read here, I don't like that. So there are some that say that he only entered into the fray of this debate because at the time in Europe, there were many people who had issues with the Moreh Nevuchim in certain parts of Europe. And some people also had problems with the Mishnah Torah that the Rambam wrote. And there even was a time where some people started burning his books in Europe, certain Jewish communities, with the assistance of Christians at the time, who didn't like some of the things he wrote also, since it contradicted Christianity. So, for example, we know from this writing here that Rabbi Yaakov Emden does not claim that he knows for a fact that Rambam didn't write the Guide to the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim. He just simply says, well, I don't believe it because I don't like what's in it. Because I don't like what's in it or agree with what's in it, I can't say that the same person wrote both books. But that's just his opinion. He doesn't claim to be an expert in Judeo-Arabic. He doesn't claim to have known the Rambam. He doesn't claim any of those things. He just simply says, I don't believe it because I don't like what's in it. Now here's where this thing gets really debunked, hard and fast. Basically, if we go to the Rambam's own son, he was a rabbi named Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam, or Rabbi Avraham Mamoni. Now, Rabbi Avraham Mamoni was the Rambam's only son. He grew up with his father. He learned from his father. And he eventually, when his father passed away, wrote a book called Milchamat Hashem. And in that book, he defends his father's philosophical doctrines that are found in the Moreh Nevuchim. So he specifically wrote that his father wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, and that he was defending the Moreh Nevuchim against people who were basically burning his books, or even saying things about the Rambam mostly in Europe. So this particular writing he wrote towards the Jewish leaders, the rabbis of province, and he basically had a very strong rebuke to them about the things that they were doing and the things they were writing against his father. And he goes into huge detail about the fact that his father wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, and the people who translated the Moreh Nevuchim from Judeo-Arabic into Hebrew, and also the people who accepted and believed and agreed with the things that Rambam wrote in the Middle East, in North Africa, and different parts. So we could almost say this is debunked right here. If the Rambam's own son is claiming the Rambam wrote it, it doesn't matter what Rabbi Yaakov Emden thinks, says, or whatever. Respect to him, but it doesn't matter what he thinks or says, because he's not an expert, and he's definitely not that close. He was never close to the Rambam, never knew the Rambam. So let's take a look at what the Rambam's own son wrote, and mention how he talks about his father's authorship of the Moreh Nevuchim. So the first thing he does in one part of the book is he mentions that he's talking about his father, Abba Mori Zichron Livracha, meaning my father, my teacher of blessed memory. The next thing he says, a little bit later on, Katav v'sefarav me'irim lemada Mori hanevuchim. Translated, that means that he wrote in his books, enlightening, basically in terms of science, also the Moreh Nevuchim. When he talks about this book called Mada, I believe he's talking about the Mishnah Torah, which has a section of it called Mada, which has similar concepts that are found in the Moreh Nevuchim. So right here in his own book, he explains that the Moreh Nevuchim is the authorship of his father. He says his father wrote that book. He mentions it a second time, a little bit later on in the next paragraph, that his father wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, and a little bit earlier he mentions that it was written in Judeo-Arabic. So he mentions that the Mishnah Torah was written in Hebrew, and this is kind of above this. I didn't mark this part, but he says at this part that the Belashon Yishmaelim V'Keru'u Moreh Nevuchim. So he says his father wrote it, and he says his father wrote it in Judeo-Arabic, or even in the Lashon Yishmaelim. So, getting back to that first point that this YouTube user was giving us. First of all, first conclusion. Rabbi Jacob ben Zvi Ashkenazi Emden was never considered the greatest researcher of authenticity of the Moreh Nevuchim of the Zohar. If you look around, you won't find anyone who claims him to be those two. He was just a rabbi, a rabbi in that era who was a great rabbi in Europe, part of Europe. But he was never considered the greatest authority of either the Moreh Nevuchim of the Zohar. Conclusion number 2. The Rambam's son is the greatest researcher of the authenticity of the Moreh Nevuchim, as proven by his own writings about his father's works. Because, of course, he grew up with his father, he heard from his father firsthand, and he even wrote information concerning his father's writings that in some cases are claimed to have been longer than what his father even wrote. So we can see that basically there's no way that some person in Europe somewhere would ever be an expert compared to someone's son who grew up with the person. So the next thing is that the Rambam's own son, who again we said was Rabbi Avraham ben Rav Moshe Maimon, attests the fact that Rambam wrote the Guide to the Perplexed, or the Moreh Nevuchim. So we can consider this first debunked. Okay, so let's go to the next point. And I accidentally jumped to the debunk button here because I'm just getting into this video. So this person claims that the next part of their issue here is that apparently they say I don't speak Arabic and have a knowledge of Judeo-Arabic and Arabic, and they says I have to be improved a lot. It says the author of the guide always uses the plural for Turks. So they have here al-Tarak, who are rooted in the north, and they quote something here that's supposed to be from the Moreh Nevuchim. Then they said the blacks, which al-Wad, so al-Sudan here, sorry, and then the next instead of al-Sud. So who are rooted in the south? Okay, so they're basically writing things in Arabic here, in Arabic script. It's very important that they're writing in Arabic script here. Okay, so logically and grammatically, he's talking about a group of people, verbs and names on plural, units by some evident characteristics such as Altic, Turkic, Baro, eyes, typical of the Mongoloids, and the black skin typical of the exactly sub-Saharan Africans. As it is not about the Africans, Africa was the name of the present-day Tunisia for you to know. Okay, so I jumped at the debunk issue here too early. Debunk number one, the Rambam didn't write an Arabic script. So everything he's written here with Arabic script is incorrect. If he was really reading the Moreh Nevuchim and claiming to know something about it, he would have written what he wrote in Judeo-Arabic script, meaning that he would have written it in Hebrew script, and it would have been like the exact words that the Rambam wrote. And we'll get into that in just a second. So so the next thing is that the Rambam wrote in Judeo-Arabic using Hebrew script. His method of description is only known to those of us who know Hebrew. So this is also very important because even though he was writing in a form of Arabic, he was still writing it using Jewish concepts and ideas. So if someone's not Jewish and has never studied these concepts and ideas, you don't really know what he was describing or what terminology he was using, but we'll get into that in just a second. Debunk number two. The Rambam clearly explains that his point is to explain an example of the kingdom metaphor he gave earlier in the text, i.e. those who have a doctrinal belief that has been passed down to them or those who do not. He's not focused on the two examples, and we'll get into what we mean by that, and that comes partially from what this person is saying about the Turks and also the people in the Sudan. So the last debunk is the Rambam brings no physical characteristics of the two groups he's describing. They are in plural because he is not talking about individuals, but instead any groups who meet the social and intellectual traits he describes. So let's get into this. So what is this all about? For some of you who've never seen that first video, and even if you saw the first video, there's a lot of things that I kind of left out because of time and because of the technology I had at the time to make videos. So in this video, I'm going to get into detail. So in one of the last books of the Moreh Nevuchim, in chapter which is 51 or Nun Aleph, essentially the Rambam starts out, and this is what you see in the red area, giving an example, because he's been dealing with all these ideas that he's teaching this student of his. And one of the last things he starts covering is the issue of humanity's relationship to the Creator. So he gives this example of a kingdom. And basically he uses this example, and then afterwards the part that people were even talking about here comes up, where he uses certain concepts that were available to him at his time to describe what he's even talking about. So let's get into the example or the simile that he gave, or the basically I guess like a form of starting out his concept. What he describes in this chapter 51 is a kingdom. And he says that there's this kingdom that has a king's palace, and there's a kingdom around it basically. And you're going to have to watch out for little dots that are going to be added there, little kind of like stars or that are going to be on the side when I identify each part. So there's a kingdom with a king's palace. There are people who are found outside of the main part of the city. So they're found outside of the gate, but they're citizens of the kingdom. They're just outside of the main gates. So you see the main gates where there are people where these little red and blue little explosion-looking dots are. That represents the people who are on the outside of this city. They're part of it, but their backs are turned towards the area of the king. Their backs are away from the actual middle part of the kingdom, and many of them don't even know who the king is. So the next thing he gets into is that there's some people, for example, who are closer to the gates of the main part of the king's palace, for example. There's some of them who are trying to find their way in, but there's some of them who have never seen the king, never heard the king, any of that. They may know of the king, they may know that they're citizens of the particular city with the kingdom, but they don't really know much about the king because they're outside of the main walls, for example, the main gates. There are also some people who are inside of the gates. They've never seen the king, they've never heard the king, but they know of him, and they are kind of advancing towards, for example, towards the king. And in some cases, those are people who, are just content with where they are inside. They have a certain know-how, but they don't have full, advanced knowledge of the king and the king's palace, for example. Now, there's another group of people who are closer to the king's palace, for example. And there's another group of people who are actually in the inner courts of the king's palace and are, moving around in different areas there. And then there's also some people who are in the most inner spaces of the king, and some of those people have even seen the king. Now, I'm going to go backwards from this example than what the Rambam gives. The people, this whole simile is a representation of the knowledge of the creator of all things, the knowledge of Hashem. The people, for example, who are like closest to the king, the dot that's like in the middle, close to the king's palace, those are the people, for example, who know Torah, who know halakha, who know philosophy, who know science, who know mathematics, and who know nature, for example, who study nature and study all these things constantly. For the Rambam, it wasn't just a matter of knowing Torah, knowing halakha, knowing Jewish law, things like that. A person had to be a scholar, a scientist, a mathematician, and these things. And those are the things that help a person develop themselves and draw them closer to the creator of all things. That's the people who are like have seen the king and inside the king's inner courts and at different levels, for example. They're not all at the same levels. The people who are on the outside are kind of people who are advancing towards that. The people who are further on the outside are kind of trying to find their way into the inner sanctum of the king. And then the people who are closest to the inside of the gates themselves are people, for example, who only know the Torah and halakha and just simply practice them and know them. So, for example, for the Rambam, those kind of people are the people who they're inside of the main parts of the kingdom. They know of the king, but they don't really have never been close to the king. They're still far away from the king because they just know the basics. They know the basics of, okay, I'm a Jew, I do this. I wake up in the morning and do this. Or as someone who's not Jewish, for example, I'm a Noahide, I do this. But they don't really investigate the inner workings of like the reality that they're born into. The people who are on the outside of that part of the gate, for example, the people who are trying to find their way into the Torah, into the halakha, and into, like, for example, the Noahide laws, and who are searching in some cases, and the people who are further away, the people who don't even know to look. They have no concept whatsoever of to look for any of this stuff, and their backs to the king because they don't know there is even a king. They're part of a kingdom, and they don't even know they're part of a kingdom. So that's the basic description of the simile that the Rambam is giving in this situation. So what he does, and a little bit past the chapter, he just tries to describe it in more detail that people might be relating to for his time. And the Rambam lived several hundred years ago, so we have to relate to the fact that his time frame is different than the modern time frame, and we'll get into that in a little bit also. So in the previous video, I showed this section here, which is broken up into several parts. The first part deals with when the Rambam starts breaking down this simile, and he starts with the people who are on the outside of the kingdom, who are supposed to be part of the kingdom but don't know the king, have never seen the king, and they have no concept of the king, and their backs are towards the king. That's described here. Now he says here that these are any type of people. So he mentions that these are any people who, for example, have nothing passed down to them in terms of tradition about theology, about the reality of the creation of all things. So anyone who falls into that, and he mentions that specifically in this section, that anyone who falls into that. So it mentions somewhere in the middle, Shehutza Ana Anisan, that basically they don't have those things. That's where they are, that they are basically outside of the kingdom. And a little bit later on, he uses this, for example, as the jumping point. So what he does a little bit later is he gives a couple examples for his own time. And one of these examples he mentions that a group of people in the north who are like the Turks. Another example he gives is the group of people who are in the south. Now the Rambam lived in Egypt, so north of him, is certain parts of Europe, certain parts of Turkey. The south of him was, the actual areas of East Africa, the northern East Africa. So he basically describes that there are certain people there who, for example, meet this criteria, who don't have any of these things passed down to them. And basically that these are just two examples. And he says that there's even some of these people where he is, like people like this, not that they're actually these people, but some people like them in the area where he's in, So we'll get into that in a little bit of detail and describe exactly what he's talking about here by actually going into the oldest text, the Moreh Nevuchim, in Judeo-Arabic. Okay, so let's get into the basic issues that the commenter brought down. Okay, so on the left side, you see what the commenter wrote in Arabic, and right below that, you see what I've taken and transliterated into like Hebrew, or Judeo-Arabic, I would say, which is the Hebrew script, in terms of what he wrote. Now, what you see on the right is what the actual Moreh Nevuchim text says. Now, you'll notice, even for those of you who don't know Hebrew, it doesn't look the same. Basically, what he's written is an Arabic script. What the Rambam wrote himself, which is on the right, is an actual Hebrew script. The Rambam, again, was writing in Judeo-Arabic, not regular modern Arabic or even past Arabic, using like the kind of almost like a cursive script. So if you look at what the YouTube user wrote, if you were to try to like write that in Hebrew, it's like al-Tarak or al-Taraga in like some types of Hebrew. Or what the Rambam was al-Tarach. So that means that it's not the same sound. So this person doesn't seem to understand Judeo-Arabic is not the same as Arabic. They seem to want to make a point as if they did, but they don't. Okay, so for example, the part you just saw that lit up there is al-tarach in Judeo-Arabic, which is the same as this below. But the YouTube user wrote something else. Now, if you try to take the same convention and write it there, the word you just saw show up now is what you would have to write if you took it from the actual Moreh Nevuchim and tried to write it into like the Arabic script. But the YouTube user wrote that instead, which would be transliterated into Hebrew like that. So we can draw a couple of conclusions from this. The first one being that the YouTube user who made this comment doesn't understand Judeo-Arabic. He may have some understanding of Arabic, but he didn't seem to really apply a really base knowledge of Arabic because he didn't seem to even have read the whole text of the Moreh Nevuchim. He seems to be focused just on this one little point, which is a very small point in the whole text. So he doesn't understand that Judeo-Arabic is not exactly Arabic. The next thing he doesn't seem to understand is that Judeo-Arabic is written in Hebrew script, or else he would have written it from the start that way instead of writing it in like an Arabic script. So we can say that this is a problem in terms of trying to trust what he's writing here. Now, here's a fuller version, a closer version of the actual area in question that shows up in one of the oldest texts of the Moreh Nevuchim. This is like several hundred years old and close to the Rambam's time. Now, the first thing we're going to notice in here is, again, what the Rambam says, shechutz anasin. So he's talking about all groups of people, shechutz. So in Judeo-Arabic, that's what you would say it, anisan. So basically, we can see here that he's not concerned with any really groups of people in terms of like what people say in modern days a race. He's just saying that there's people, any groups of people who don't have any of this information passed down theologically to them. These are the people that he's saying are outside of the city. They're citizens of the kingdom, but they're outside of the main city of the kingdom, and that they have their backs turned to the Creator. Now, one of the things this person tries to comment on, and usually when people try to claim this thing about the Rambam being a racist, and what the Nation of Islam did is they focused on in the part where he mentions As-Sudan. So this section here is when the Rambam mentions that there's a group of people who he's talking about in As-Sudan who also fall into this category, for example, of not having theological information passed down to them by way of their ancestors, by way of philosophy and things like that. So in order to deal with this issue, let's look at a couple things. Okay, so the first thing is the term As-Sudan, okay, which shows up in the Moreh Nevuchim. So that's here. That's the actual written part of it. So this word in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew script, for example, you can read a little bit better, is there. And then of course the YouTube user wrote that. So that's basically the same thing. Now that's in terms of the actual word itself. Now, one of the things that was funny is in my previous video, I also stated that the term Al-Sudan was plural. I actually mentioned how it's plural. It's talking about groups of people, not just one thing. So the YouTube user, for some reason, didn't catch that. And one thing he doesn't seem to know, because he doesn't know Jewish terminology and also Jewish history, is that the same word that can be used for As-Sudan is also a word that can be used in modern Hebrew as well as postmodern, a little bit earlier modern Hebrew, is Kushim. Now the interesting thing is the word in the Jewish context of As-Sudan or Kushim does not mean black. It doesn't mean anything about the actual color. It's actually talking about a region, and it doesn't mean black people. The next thing is that Kush was an ancient East African kingdom, and it was a rival to Egypt, and it also represented the most well-known kingdom in East Africa to many Jews and many people in the Middle East, south of Egypt, especially to the Israelis. Many of them would have only known about Kush, and they wouldn't have known about everywhere else. So as terms of their map is concerned, when they're talking about a location, they're okay, well, there's a place somewhere out there called Kush. Okay, I don't know how far it goes, I don't know how big it is, but there's some place called Kush out there somewhere. Now the next thing is that Kush was considered no different than Assyria or Babel, the Babylonians. They were just a kingdom that was out there, and eventually the region became known as Kush, and a person from Kush would have been a Kushi, and some people from Kush would have been Kushim. Nothing negative about the term. It was just simply that from the kingdom of Kush, there were people called Kushim, the same way that people from Assyria are called Surim, and the same way that people from Babel are Babelim. So it's just talking about, a location that there, was a known kingdom. Okay, now one thing that's also interesting is if you look at the actual text that of the Moreh Nevuchim here, you'll notice that it doesn't look anything like what the YouTube user wrote. And in fact, here's some detail. This is the way you would take that particular text and write it in the modern Hebrew script so that it's easier to legible to read. Now you'll notice that there's two letters that I have marked in red. That's a letter called Gimel, or in this sense it's called Remel. Now, it would be interesting to note that when you look at the YouTube user, when he tried to supposedly quote what the Rambam is writing here, where the Rambam wrote, Al-Matu'lin fi al-Junub. Now, al-Junub, for example, and also the word al-Matu'lin, are basically the attempt of using the word Gimel. Now in Arabic, they don't have, like, for example, a gimel, for example, the letter gimel that's used to make that sound. They have rein. The rein, for example, is written with the same letter as ein. So ein and the rein are the same like letter, but they have the rein has a dot on it. So that's what this person writes. Now, if we were to take what he wrote and put that into Hebrew, in the Hebrew script, similar to the Judeo-Arabic script here, we would have to put eins there in order to like transliterate what he wrote. But that's not the same word. So this means that this person does not understand Judeo-Arabic, or else they would have written what they wrote differently. So let's get into a conclusion about that. So again, as we mentioned before, we can conclude that this person does not actually have the actual text of the Moreh Nevuchim, especially not in Judeo-Arabic, that they probably can't even read Judeo-Arabic. It's even possible, and I kind of thought about this, that the person just simply went into like Google Translate and like put whatever they could put in there in Arabic in there because they don't know enough about Hebrew to write it in Hebrew. And it wouldn't have come out correctly in Hebrew because Judeo-Arabic, written in Hebrew script or written in Ashuri script, is not something that you can easily take into Google Translate and come out with the right information. So I'm basically thinking that this person's kind of made that up. And again, he doesn't really quote the entire text. He only quotes like a small part of it, and specifically this one little part, and he doesn't quote anything else about it. Okay, so let's get back to what the Rambam's getting at here. Okay, first of all, the above section of the Moreh Nevuchim makes it clear that the point of the discussion is about any human being who has no theological tradition passed down to them, no matter where in the world they're from. And that's something the Rambam mentions, that it's like anywhere, it doesn't matter where they're from. If they have no theological information passed down to them, they're like the people on the outside of this kingdom who are part of it, but their backs to the king and they don't know who the king even is. And from there, we can basically see that from, basically using his terminology and using his concepts here, that if there were a group of people in As-Sudan, or who are considered As-Sudan, who have theological traditions that were passed down to them, they would not be subject to the topic he's talking about here of the people who are outside of the city. Because if they have all this information passed down to them through tradition and through investigation, as the Rambam mentioned, then they're the people who are in the inside of the city at different levels, who know who the king is. But he's saying that there are people who don't know who the king is. For example, there's some people in the north somewhere, and there's people in the south somewhere. And we're going to see now pretty soon of like what he means by that, in more detail. But he's basically saying, okay, there's people out there who don't know who the king is, or outside of the kingdom, and they don't have any theological information passed down to them. So let's get into that issue a little bit now. This particular word here, and this is Judeo-Arabic, of course, again, ka'ataraf. Ka'ataraf basically is a word that is used as a qualifier, meaning that this word here qualifies everything that comes after it concerning the Turks that the Rambam mentions and the people who are As-Sudan. So al-Tarikh and As-Sudan that he's talking about are connected to this qualifier, meaning that if we know what this word means, we can basically say what the rest of what he's talking about means. So when we look at this word, ka'ataraf. Ka'ataraf in Judeo-Arabic basically is talking about something that's distant, it's far off, it's remote, it's off the beaten path. So basically, essentially, we can say that the Rambam is talking about people who are off the beaten path, who are like remote, distant, who have no connection, similar to the people in this description of the city. That they're far away from the king because they're so far off. They don't know who the king is, but they're part of the kingdom. They're still people. They're human beings. They're part of the kingdom that the Creator created. But because they're so far off, it's almost as if they're like not that far away from like the animals themselves. But they're not animals. They're human beings with the intellect of a human being. But because of the fact that they haven't any of these concepts passed down to them, you can basically say that they're not that far off, but that's what the Rambam's saying here. Now, one of the things in Hebrew, the word that would be used to describe this kind of concept of being distant, remote, or far off the path, in order to translate ataraf into modern Hebrew, you could use the word nidach or miktsot. So those two words, for example, would be used to denote something that's distant or far off or off the beaten path. So we're not talking about just regular people who are in these regions. We're talking about people who are off into the backwater parts of these areas. They're far off, they're distant, they're remote, they're off the beaten path from everything that's there. And this particular translation of the word ataraf is actually confirmed by Rabbi Yosef Kaifach, who is widely recognized as one of the top-level modern experts in the Rambam's writings. Okay, so let's deal with this issue here. this is a particular part of that last comment that this person made. I think it's interesting that as much as they want to claim that the Moreh Nevuchim is racist and that the Rambam's racist, what they wrote here themselves, this Elohim Chaim person, what he wrote is racist. He says here, logically and grammatically, he, talking about the Rambam, is talking, or the author of the Moreh Nevuchim, is talking about a group of people, verbs and names, or on plural, units by some evident characteristics such as Altaic, Turkic, Baro eyes, typical of the Mongoloids, and the black skin typical for exactly sub-Saharan Africans, as it's not about Africans. Africa is the name of the present-day Tunisia for you to know. Now, here's what's interesting. Debunk number one on this. The Rambam did not give any physical traits to any of the people mentioned. Nowhere in the Moreh Nevuchim. He only mentions the people of the Turkims, of Turkey and also of Sudan. He only mentions them twice. And it's only like a very brief mention. So he never mentions anything physical about them. Further, all locations on the planet are full of diverse types of people who do not meet any overall exclusive physical traits. So you can't claim, for example, that in every part of like the Turkish regions that there's people who have that kind of barrel eyes. It's not typical of everybody. It's only typical of the people you know. And there's people who move to those regions from different areas who bring with them differences. And the same thing with any part of Africa. There's people in different parts of Africa. And interestingly enough, the Rambam never mentions sub-Saharan Africa. He didn't use any terminology that is denoted in Judeo-Arabic texts as sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll prove that out in just a little bit. But again, the Rambam used no physical traits, but this YouTube user is making up physical traits, and saying, oh, this is what this person is and that person is. And, the issue of it's not all about Africans. Well, Rambam never made it about all Africans. In fact, he made divisions between what he was talking about here. And he's very clear about, look, in the north, there's people like this too. And he's like, it's any person. Now, another debunk is Elohim Chaim, this commenter, is the only person to assign physical traits. The Rambam didn't do it. He didn't make any physical connections to any of these people. He just simply said anyone who does not have information passed down to them. Not anything about physical, anything about what they look, what they are like in that way. Just simply what their intellect is and what their social structure is. So let's look at the qualifying statements the Rambam uses and understand what he's writing here. The first qualifying statement that is found in this part of the text here, where he mentions that any and all human beings who do not have theological concepts passed down to them from their ancestors are the people that he's talking about in terms of this area of being on the outside of the city, being citizens of the kingdom, but not knowing who the king is and having their backs turned to it, and not having a way into the city because they don't even understand that they have a king. For example, in the previous part we mentioned about the word ataraf. Ataraf is basically the word the Rambam uses to denote people who are far off, distant, remote, and off the beaten path. So the two locations he gives are the people who can be termed in those locations who are off the beaten path, who are far in distance, and who are not just like regular people walking around. So the next thing is that he mentions that there are certain people in the north and in the south. These people are the north and the south are just two examples that he's giving. He's not trying to get into details about saying, okay, I'm specifically talking about everybody who's south of Egypt. Well, what about to the west of Egypt? What about to the east of it? He's simply saying there's some people here, there's some people there, and here are the qualifiers. Any person who doesn't have this, for example, like some people in the way off distant part of this location, some people in the way off distant part of this location. And he even says that there's certain people who are like those people who also lack down past information that's theological about, the concepts we were talking about earlier. Okay, so here we have another point that's debunked. Okay, the Rambam didn't write in Arabic script. He wrote in Judeo-Arabic using Hebrew Ashuri script. His method of description is only known to those of us who know Hebrew and Jewish concepts. Debunk number 2. The Rambam clearly explains that his point is to explain the example of the kingdom metaphor he gave earlier in the text, i.e. those who have a doctrinal belief passed down to them versus those who do not. That's the point he's trying to make, and it has nothing to do with any physical traits of any person, which he doesn't use any. The Rambam brings no physical characteristics to the two groups he's mentioning as his example of people who are far off and who are citizens of the kingdom but have their backs turned to the king because they don't know who the king is because they have nothing passed down to them. Now again, people sometimes get caught up in the language that Rambam uses about those people, not just those two groups, but any people like them who don't have this information passed on them. He says that they're not animals, but they're just kind of above it. Which people all the time use those type of imagery. There are people who say, well, a person who does crime or does these kind of heinous acts is like an animal. Is that person saying this person's an animal? No, he's saying, well, this person lacks this, They're like, just right above the animals. They're human. They have intellects like a human, but they're acting like an animal. And that's the point that he's making here, that for him, he says, it's my opinion, that, basically, people who don't meet this social intellectual criteria, it's as if they're right above the animals. They're not animals, but they're just right above it, because they don't have this information. It's like they're part of this kingdom, and they have no idea that they're a part of the kingdom or who even the king is. And that's what he's describing there. And he just uses a couple examples of what he's talking about, but it's not specific to any physical traits. Now, bonus debunk to this is the Rambam makes clear the statement that anyone who meets this social intellectual traits he describes freely fits into the categories he creates. So anybody who meets any of these criterion fits in those criterions alone. So what this means is that any person who fits into this criterion, either of having this information or not having this information, having, a deep interest in science and study of mathematics, they can easily fit into any of these categories, depending on what their intellectual and social situation is and what they develop in their own situations of social and intellectual traits, for example. So now let's deal with the last point that this person makes, where they say the author of the guide is definitely a racist, specifically discriminative towards yellow and black races. Race again. We'll get into that in just a second, which was typical for most noble Semitic nations, such as the Jews, the Arabs, the Yazidis, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, and many others who didn't survive until today. Cheers. Okay, cheers to you too. So let's get into that. Debunk number 1. Earlier, this person claimed that the Rambam did not write the Moreh Nevuchim. Now they seem to be claiming that he is racist because of something written in the Moreh Nevuchim. So which one is it? Are you claiming that he wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, or did he not write the Moreh Nevuchim? I mean, this person went to a lot of trouble to say that Rabbi Jacob Enden claimed that the Rambam didn't write it. So now is he saying the Rambam wrote it? And the Rambam didn't write it, then the Rambam's not a racist, if that's what we're trying to say here. But again, I think this person is just kind of pulling points out of the air and just trying to put them together in some way to just say something. Debunk number 2. The concept of race is a modern construction. It did not exist during the time of the authorship of the Guide to the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim. This is proven by comments made by contemporary Jewish explorers to the East Africa. Contemporary meaning during the time of the Rambam. There were Jewish explorers to East Africa who described it in ways different than the modern racial concepts, and actually support what I mentioned earlier. And I actually showed this in my previous video, but I'm going to show it again in a different way in this video. Debunk number 3. This commenter, this YouTube commenter, seems to claim that racism is typical for Semitic nations, but that statement itself sounds racist. I mean, you can't say what all Jews, Arabs, Yazidis, and Assyrians and Chaldeans held by. So that sounds like you're being racist by even making that statement. If you're trying to say that some people are racist, okay, fine. There's some people who might be racist, whether they be Jewish or not, Arab or not, Yazidis or not, Assyrians or not, or Chaldeans or not. But again, race, as we're going to see, is a modern Western invention. Some of these kingdoms didn't like each other. I mean, the Kushite kingdom, for example, often had wars with the Egyptian kingdoms and back and forth. So is one side racist because they had a war with someone else? Or there's it's competing cultures. But let's get into it a little bit deeper. Okay, so one of the things that's important about understanding any writing is to understand it from the author's perspective. So one of the things that has been championed by people who are experts in the Rambam is that you understand the Rambam from his own words and not just like people making stuff up. The Rambam often explains the concepts he has in different writings he has, but you can also understand them from different writings of different Jewish authors at the time who were contemporaries. So let's deal with the issues of the inhabitants of Kush, the place that is often known in some Jewish circles in Judeo-Arabic writing as Sudan, those people there. Now again, there's no one situation where they can say, okay, well, this is like the entire group of people who live in this whole region, because again, they didn't know everybody in the region. In some cases, they're just simply saying there's some place out there and some area, it's called Kush, where the Kushite kingdom used to be, or is, or was, and there's people there. So let's see what the Rambam says in the Mishnah Torah, which is the halakhic or the Jewish law elements of his writing, which he wrote in Hebrew. So here he writes, Lefikach sheyitgayer hager b'zaman hazeh b'chol makom. So he's saying that, in the time that we live in, that people, basically can become gerim. That means the person who joins the Jewish nation at any time, from any place. So he gives a couple examples. He says, Ben Adomi, the Edomites, Ben Mitzri, the Egyptians, Ben Ammoni, the people from Ammon, Ben Moavi, the Moabites, and Ben Kushi. So Ben Kushi, he says that all of these people that he just mentioned can join the Jewish nations by becoming gerim. So if he had such a problem with people who were from Sudan, who were Sudan, he would have easily said, nope, not those guys. those guys can't join the Jewish nation. But he says clearly here that they can. And he says here, Muturin lavo hakahal miyad. So basically what he mentioned earlier was that there was a time where there were certain groups of people, mainly the Mitzrayim, the Adamim, the Ammonim, and the Moavim, who were not allowed to join the Jewish nation for a certain period of time, a certain amount of generations. But after the time of the Assyrian conquest of different areas, they mixed up people to the point where you can't identify those people anymore. And that was the major issue of having people who held by certain ideas that were contrary to the Torah, who would be identifiable, and that they couldn't join the Jewish nation until like several generations later. This was never the case of anybody from Cush, because as we know, that Moses' wife was considered to be from Cush, even though she was from a place called Midian. But as we know, we're talking about the kingdom of Cush, the Malchut. So how do we know that Cush, for example, was not some like concrete fluid term, also meaning that Sudan was not some concrete fluid, like concrete term, but it was more of a fluid term, actually, to say. Well, one of the ways we can know that is by looking a little bit deeper into is Cush a race, a location, or a kingdom? And with the term, As-Sudan, it would be the same thing. Is it, just some term that kind of has a fluid-like meaning depending on who's writing in the context? Well, from the Sefer Esther, we learned that during the time of Achashverosh, I always have problems with that name, who was the king, from one point where it mentions in the green, Mehodu Va'ad Cush. So we know that that was his Medina, which is mentioned in gray. So basically we know that the king of Assyria at one point had a rulership that went from Hodu to Cush, and it was his Medina, meaning a kingdom. So we know that the term Hodu and Cush, had some kind of fluid ideas. Hodu considered to be like around the area of India. So from India all the way to East Africa, that was his, at one point, rulership. So there we see that, how we want to determine like location is kind of fluid upon the situation of what kingdom was in charge of it. Okay, so think of it like this. Okay, you have an area of East Africa, which part of it was known as Kush. Another part was the Aksum Empire, the Ethiopian Empire, and the Ugandi Empire. So some of these different empires, for example, overlapped in some cases, like one, conquered the other one. But if you look at the two people I have on the right side here, both of these men could be considered As-Sudan, according to Jewish terminology, because they're from a region that makes them As-Sudan. It has nothing to do with like the race, because the Rambam mentioned no physical traits to any of them. And these are areas that are known areas. Cush was a known area to the Egyptians. They knew exactly where it was. Ethiopia was known to the Egyptians even to the Rambam's time. So they knew exactly where it was. But we're talking about people who were off the beaten path. So basically, if anybody who's from this region has theological concepts passed down to them, that the negative things that the Rambam wrote about those kind of people who don't have them don't apply to these guys. They both have theological concepts passed down to them through their fathers, from their fathers' fathers, grandfathers, throughout the generations. So that's not the point he's making. The point he's making is about people who are off the beaten path in unknown areas, in some areas that are like, out of the, the way, if you will, or that are off the beaten track, who don't have any of this information passed down to them. So it has nothing to do with the types of people, and both of these guys are from the same region. So you can't just say, oh, well, it's like sub-Saharan Africa, is this part of Africa. Well, there's people of different types in those areas. There's not one physical trait that meets either one of them. If you look at these two guys, they have different skin types, they have different noses, they have different facial structures, and basically, if you were to see them in different areas, you would never think that they were from the same place. Now, let's get into the Western racial concept. The Western racial concept, of course, is different than this, because as we know, there was a man named, I think his name was Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was the first proposed, the classification that was modernly used. And this is in 1779. He was widely used in the 19th century, where he was the one who developed the idea that the Ethiopian, black race, the Caucasian race, white race, the Mongolian, yellow race, the American, red race, the Malayan, brown race. So this is kind of confusing, because when you think about it, there's some people who could be considered Ethiopian who are actually not black. They're actually brown. So are they Malayan because of the fact that they're brown? Maybe. There's some people who have African ancestry who can be considered yellow. Are they Mongolian all of a sudden? There's some people who can be considered red who are from Europe. Are they like American? Then the next thing is that in the mid-20th century, racial classifications are used, for example, by the anthropologist Carlton S. Kuhn, and he divided humanity into 5 races: Caucasoid, white race; Negroid, black race; Capoid, Bushman Hottentots race; Mongoloid, Oriental Amerindian race; and Australioid, Australian Aborigine and Papuan race. So as we can see, all of this racial stuff is like, in terms of like physical features and skin colors, more of a modern thing. I mean, there may have been times where people use something to say, okay, well, this person from this one area looks like this, but to say like an overall group of people who don't look alike and who don't share the same concepts and background, that they're all one people, that's more of a modern thing. Most of the time in the ancient times, people were concerned about what kingdom you were from, what ethnic group you were from, what people who were connected to each other, what language did you speak. These things connected you as a people, not just simply like facial features and all that kind of stuff. A lot of the definitions that this YouTube user using in terms of race and yellow and brown and black and all that, that's all like modern stuff, but that's not what the Rambam used. Rambam didn't mention anything about any physical traits and connecting them to any like groups of people. So another example is in modern Western racial concepts, all of these four colors are considered black. In America, if you are from like actual black to brown to light brown to like mocha colored, you are black if they want you to be black. So that means that, for example, these two women are black. So one of the women on the right, who's from Senegal, she's like black because she's literally physically black. But the one on the next to her is like a lot lighter. She can't really be considered logically black unless you're saying black as a culture. But even then, well, the one on the right's from Senegal, the other one's from America. That's not the same culture. You know, they're not the same people. They're not from the same ancestry. So also in America, all of the people in these pictures, black. Because that's how Americans, you know, kind of go with this race thing, that, you know, brown, black, everything in between, everything on the sides is black if we want it to be black. If you have any percentage of something that makes you African, black. You know, same thing with the white. You know, we're not going to deal with the white part now, but that's, you know, we're dealing with this part. So this is not the Rambam was even dealing with at all, because it has nothing to do with what he's talking about. He's talking about the intellect. He's talking about the concepts that people have that are passed down to them, not like what they look like, you know, physically. And even the concept of race is something that modern people are saying is like a nonsense anyway. So, you know, it's funny that this YouTube user is using concepts that don't make any sense and have nothing to do with the text whatsoever. So in order to prove what I'm saying out, I'm going to bring back up something I mentioned in the previous video about a rabbi named Rabbi Benjamin Tuudela, who had made a number of travels throughout like Europe, the Middle East, and East Africa. Now, what he was actually a contemporary of the Rambam. He lived around the same time as the Rambam, which is several hundred years ago. And he mentions in one of his writings about this trip that he took through East Africa. And through his trip to East Africa, he learned about other parts of Africa. So let's see what he mentions here. First thing he mentions, Hayorid me'eretz Kush. Okay, so he says like basically we got off at the place called Kush, or, you know, we kind of arrived at the place called Kush is what he's trying to say here. Nikrat al-Habash. So he says this place called Kush we arrived at is also called al-Habash. Nikrat al-Habash. So Kush is also known as al-Habash. So it has two names. So this lends into what we were saying earlier. Al-Habash is another name for Kush. So some of these areas have several names depending on who's writing about them. Now the next thing he mentions, okay, oh, actually not the next thing, but going back to this, we're saying here that, you know, what I was trying to break down was me'eretz Kush. So this is me'eretz, this word here. This is the word Kush. This is Hanikrat al-Habash. Me'eretz Kush, Hanikrat al-Habash. So he landed in a place called Kush, which is also known as al-Habash. So what's the next thing he says that's important here? He says, Misham holuchim hashiriyot mahalach 50 yom derech hamidbar hagadol shehanikra al-Sahara. So al-Sahara, it means the Sahara Desert. That's the way he was writing it, pronounced al-Sahara. So he says that from this place called Kush where he landed, which is in East Africa that you see on the map, that basically a travel of about 50 days through the desert, a big desert known as the Sahara. He says, Lamidinat Zola Hi Havila Be'eretz Ghana. And all of this I wrote down before, but now I have the better ability to show you exactly what I'm going through here. So we know that Ghana is in West Africa. So he says about 50 days through the Midbar, through a desert called the Sahara, you can get to Ghana from Kush, from Al-Habash. So let's break that down. He says Havila or Hawila Be'eretz Ghana. So he says that Ghana is known as Havila, and it's, you know, Havila is in this place called Ghana. So this means that from Kush to Ghana is two separate places, two separate locations. He knows there's a big difference between Kush and Ghana. He knows that they're two separate locations. If he wanted to say that they were the same, he would have said, okay, I went through Kush, and then further than Kush, there's another place called Kush, 50 days into the desert, you know, whatever the desert is, doesn't matter, but it's all Kush. All of this is Kush, that's Kush over there, Kush over here, but no, he says that there's Kush, and then there's Ghana. And he wrote it at the same time as the Rambam. Now, let's go through this again. He says, Me'eretz Kush, Nikrat al-Habash. Me'eretz Kush Hanikrat al-Habash. He knows that there's a difference between Eretz Kush, which is also known as al-Habash, and he says that Havila be'eretz Ghana. So we see here that there's a big difference between the two locations we're talking about here. He knows that there's a place called Kush, which is also known as al-Habash. He knows that there's a place that's Havila, which he calls Ghana, which he knows about Ghana. So this rabbi from the same time period knew that there were different types of people here. So again, we know that the Rambam also knew this too. So again, going back to this concept, al-Sudan is basically talking about people who are like a certain type of Kushim. Al-Sudan just by itself, just can be basically the Kushim. People from Kush, the kingdom of Kush, the area of Kush, what I think is Kush. There's some place out there called Kush. That's kind of what Jewish writers are saying. In some cases, they had no idea what was out there. They simply heard stories, maybe saw like part of a map, and someone's like, there's some place out there called Kush. Where is it? I don't know. It's like somewhere, south of Mitzrayim, south of Egypt, somewhere across from Arabia, across some water. It's out there somewhere. It's some place. Beyond that, some people didn't know anything beyond that. This, their only map would have been like what you see here. At the same time, we know that the Kushim and the Ga'anim were not the same people. We know that people from Ghana and people from Kush were not the same. And even Rabbi Tuadela tells us that they're not the same people because they don't share the same culture, they don't share the same history, and they don't even share the same location. A desert separates them, so they obviously are not the same people. So going back, this is a slide that's from my previous video, the first video I did about whether the Rambam is racist or not. So an actual way to translate what the Rambam wrote in its entirety when he describes this parable, the example that he gave earlier about the kingdom, where basically you can say, now I shall interpret to you this parable that I have invented. I say then, those who are outside the city, who are all human individuals who have no doctrinal belief, neither one based on speculation, nor one that accepts the authority of tradition. Such individuals as the furthermost Turks found in the remote north, and the Sudanese found in the remote south, and those who resemble them from among them that are with us in these climes. The status of those is like that of irrational animals. To my mind, they do not have the rank of men, but have among them beings of rank lower than the rank of men, but higher than the rams and apes. For they have the external shape and lineaments of man, and a faculty of discernment that is superior to that of the apes. So what the Nation of Islam try to claim is they changed the words here. They changed the English translation that they received to try to make it seem as if the Rambam is saying that they are apes, rather than saying that they're superior to the apes. Simply saying that they're, because of the people he's talking about, is any human individual who has no doctrinal beliefs, neither based on speculation nor one that accepts the authority of tradition. And he's saying that, hey, there's a couple examples I can give. There's some people in the remote area, of the north. There's some people in some remote areas of the south. And, there's people here in this area where I'm at right now who are like them. And their status is like an irrational animal. And he's like saying there's people who don't have this information, don't have, the highly developed, the ability to develop their text based upon the information passed down to them. Not that they don't have the ability to be, intellectual. It's just simply saying that they have nothing passed down to them, to bring them to the level that he's like saying in this example that he gave of knowing the creator based upon things that are passed down, knowing that they're part of this city where they don't know in this area. So he's not saying that they're animals, he's saying they're above animals, but in terms of their intellect, it's like they're basically like irrational. Again, and he's not making any physical statements about any of these people. He's just simply saying that there's some people somewhere as an example, that anyone who's like them, anyone, any individual who doesn't have these things, that's what I'm talking about. So basically, we go back over what this person wrote. We've gone through all of the information bit by bit. We've debunked each point that he has made, and essentially we can say that this person is essentially making up stuff and it does not know the information that they claim I don't know. Now again, I'm not claiming to be some Arabic expert, but I do know Judeo-Arabic. So I know where to read it, I know I understand it, and I've got enough people around me to know how to help me with it in areas where I don't know. I know also, for example, that if someone really knew Judeo-Arabic, they wouldn't be writing an Arabic script, they'd be writing in a Hebrew script. I also know that Rabbi Yaakov Emden was never an expert or never considered by anyone to be an expert in the Moreh Novachim and its authenticity. I know that the Rambam's son is the expert in that because he was the Rambam's son. I also know that these physical traits of this person, this YouTube user, is pulling out for people who he claims are Turkic, also from sub-Saharan Africa, which never shows up in the Rambam's writing. The Rambam never mentions the statement sub-Saharan Africa. Sudan in Judeo-Arabic does not mean sub-Saharan Africa. It's just simply saying, hey, there's some stuff out there, some people out there, somewhere into the south. That's why the Rambam had to use those qualifiers. Further to that, this person wants to say, oh, okay, well, all Jews, Arabs, and Yazidis, and Assyrians, and Chaldeans are all like racist. And he also said the author of the Guide to the Plex is racist, but he also claims that the Guide to the Plex author was not the Rambam. So again, I think we can easily say that based upon everything that I presented, and hopefully the written information presents it in some cases better than I can say it in words, that we can see that this has been debunked. So again, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and I hope this video helped. Again, there's areas where I'm, I may be reading this fast, going through it fast, but that's because I'm just into the topic. And yeah, that's it.